which we have on Thursday. On Thursday, inshallah, we will be solving the end of the chapter questions, inshallah, of the last chapter, this breathing and respiration. All right, boys? So today I am going to play a revision video for you guys from the chapter blood and circulation, because we have also not solved the end of chapter questions of the blood and circulation. So inshallah we will be solving the end of chapter questions of the blood and circulation as well. All right, boys, got it?
Yes, sir.
Back.
And if you do not hear this sound, please tell me, okay?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Did you hear the sound, boys?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right.
In today's lecture, we are going to study further about the anatomy and some of the other functions of the heart. The last time we did not discuss about the lub-dub sound. Today we are going to talk about that. Where does this sound comes from in the heart? Now, you know that according to the principles of the physics, the things always move from higher pressure towards the lower pressure. Now, when the blood moves into the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle, and I'm showing it again with the help of the blue color, the blood which is going into the pulmonary artery, that is deoxygenated blood, which goes into the lungs. And same, when the blood goes from the left ventricle into the aorta, the blood is oxygenated blood. Now, at that time, in the pulmonary artery and in the aorta, the blood pressure is highest. But when the both ventricles, they try to relax, at that time in the ventricles, the pressure becomes low and the blood will try to come back. But at that time, what happens that in our aorta and also in our pulmonary artery, there are special valves, and these valves are called as semilunar valves. I'm representing in the pulmonary artery with the black color, and in the aorta I represented it with the blue color. Now let me label this. This valve which is present in the aorta, this is called as aortic semilunar valve, and this which is present in the pulmonary artery, this is called as pulmonary semilunar valve. Now, in the last lecture we have already discussed about the valve. That valve is a structure which prevents the backflow of the blood. Now, what does this semilunar means? Now, the word semi, all of you know, it means half. And the word lunar, it means moon. Now, this semilunar valve, its flaps, they are half moon shaped, like this. So when these valves, they are half moon shaped, and when the blood will try to come back into the ventricles, the blood will try to reverse back. When the blood will try to reverse back from higher pressure to the lower pressure, at that time these valves, they will close like this. When these valves, they will close like this, at that time, because of the higher pressure in the arteries, the valve, their flaps, they will hit with each other with the force. So when in the aorta where the pressure is the highest, at that time a louder sound will be produced, lub sound. And in the pulmonary artery where the pressure is lower than the aorta, at that time dub sound will come. So lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. This is how the sound will be produced. In my explanation, I says that actually what is happening, that inside your pulmonary artery and aorta, your semilunar valves, they are clapping for you, and the person is alive till his heart is clapping, lub dub. So this is how the blood is being pumped, and this is how this lub dub sound is produced. Another very important point which we need to know, that if you guys remember that we discussed that there are 4 chambers of the heart, and these 4 chambers, they are separated from each other with the help of walls. Now the names of the walls we do not need to discuss in this grade or in the O levels, but what we need to know the names, we see what we simply call these walls as the walls between the chambers of the heart. The singular is called as septum. This is singular, and the plural is septa. So if I just talk about the wall in between 2 ventricles, then it will be simply called as septum. Usually its complete name is interventricular septum, but we are not that detail. That detail is in A levels. Same, you see, if you see that there is a wall in between 2 atria, so we will call it interatrial septum. But you see, even if you see that there is a wall between the atrium and ventricle, remember that this one is also a septum. So this one will be called as interatrioventricular septum. Again, you just need to know about the septum. So as there are more than one septum, so that is why we also need to know about the plural, which is septa. So here we conclude our lecture about the heart. Now we are going to start the next lecture, that is about the blood vessels. Now, as you guys know that we have 3 types of blood vessels. First, we are going to talk about arteries. Now, remember one thing, and for the rest of your life, that you never say that the arteries carry oxygenated blood. Why? In the last lecture, we just discussed in detail that arteries, they do contain deoxygenated blood. The example is pulmonary artery, which divides into 2 and further divides into 4. So what is the proper wording we should use for the arteries? So remember one thing, whenever we give an explanation for the arteries, we always say that the arteries carry blood away from the heart. Away or out of heart. Now, as we have seen that the pulmonary artery, it was taking the blood away from the heart, out of the heart. As did you guys see that aorta, which is the largest artery of our body and which has the highest blood pressure in our body, was carrying the blood out of the heart, away from the heart. Next important thing which you need to know is that the arteries, they have thick walls. Now again, the explanation right now which I will give you guys, that will be just related to O levels, not more than that. In A levels there is more detail and there are more scientific names as well. Now usually there are 3 layers of the tissues over here, but according to your grade we will only discuss 2 layers. Now this is the outer layer and this is the inner layer. There is another layer which is made up of just 1 layer of cells, which we are going to discuss in the A levels. Now this is called as outer muscular layer. Now remember one thing, that all the muscles which are attached with our bones, they are called as skeletal muscles, and rest of the muscles which make our organs or the other tissues, they are smooth muscles. So here in this outer layer of the, you see, muscular layer, there are smooth muscle, but we are not going into that much detail more. Then this one is called as inner elastic layer. Now, why do we call it as elastic layer? Because this layer of the tissues, it has the capability of stretching and recoiling. Means that this part of the tissue, it contains elastic fibers in it. Because of this, it can contract and relax. Now, as this, there are smooth muscles which can contract, relax to a certain extent, but not too much like our skeletal muscles. These are smooth muscles which cannot contract that much. But because of this elastic layer, our tissues, you see this layer, it can stretch and recoil. There is one very important function that is only present in the arteries out of these 3 blood vessels, and that is pulse. So because of this, the arteries, they have pulse. Now, remember one thing, whenever you guys go to the doctor takes your wrist in his hand whenever you have fever or something, and he puts his 2 fingers on your wrist at a certain position and presses it and starts watching or starts looking at his watch. He counts something in a certain period of time. Actually, what is he doing? He is counting the number of pulses per minute. Now, usually a normal person, he has 70 pulse per minute. But if you have fever or something, definitely there will be some disturbance in the pulse rate. Now, this 70 per minute, this is called as pulse rate. Now, remember one thing, that your heartbeat and your pulse, they are exactly the same, because you see, the number of time your heart beats, same number of time your arteries, they also contract and relax. They help in pumping the blood forward. Now, remember one more thing, that these arteries, they are present deep in muscles and tissues. But there are few points in our body where these arteries are not that much deep, so the pulse can be easily felt. Now, one of the examples is that where the doctor puts his fingers over here, and other, you see, in the neck region as well, where the pulse can be easily felt, or you see in the head, you see where you see these arteries are not that much deep, so the pulse can be easily felt over there. Next thing which we are going to discuss is that this is the empty space in the blood vessel. Now, this empty space, it is called as lumen. Now, remember one thing, whenever there is a pipe, all these pipes, they have empty space through which the liquid can flow. Same are blood vessels, they are just like pipes. And in those pipes, there must be some empty space through which the blood should flow, and that empty space is called as lumen. Now, one very important thing which we need to know about the lumen of the arteries, that they have narrow lumen. Now, when the arteries, they have narrow lumen, because of this narrow lumen, there is high blood pressure. Now, there are 2 reasons for high blood pressure in the arteries. One of the reasons is that because of the narrow lumen, and second, the heart pumps blood into arteries with force. So that is why the blood pressure is higher in the arteries. Another very important thing which we need to know about the arteries, that the arteries, they do not have valves except aorta. Now we just discussed that aorta does contain aortic semilunar valve. So none other artery has the valves. Now I just explained you as well that why does the aorta has the semilunar valve, so that the blood should not come back into the heart, it should just move in the forward direction. Now usually in the arteries the blood pressure is 120 millimeters of mercury. Now this was all about the arteries in this grade you guys need to know. Now next we are going to talk about capillaries. Now remember one thing, when the arteries divide, they form smaller arteries which are called as arterioles. Now let me label that these arterioles, they are actually smaller arteries. And when these arterioles, they divide, then the capillaries are made. Now I'm going to explain in detail about the capillaries right now, that the capillaries, interestingly, their outer wall is made up of just one cell. They are only one cell thick outer layer. Now, draw one capillary over here. I would like to draw over here. So as it is a blood vessel, so I would draw it like a pipe. Now this is just one layer of cells I'm drawing. You can see that this is one layer of cells. Now as this is actually a two-dimensional diagram, so you can only see one layer of cells on one side, on the other side, but it is actually just like a pipe. Like if you see on this marker, it is a round, so this is also round, and you can see at the ends, if you guys want me, I can draw this like this to show that this is a layer of cells in round. Now interestingly, that the lumen of these capillaries, this is so much narrow that the red blood cells can only move in one single line. They can only move in single line. We call that the red blood cells, they are moving in a queue. Let me label it over here, that and I'm not writing complete red blood cells, I'm writing RBCs. They move in a queue. Now when these red blood cells, they move in a queue, why? Because the lumen is so much narrow. But you guys can see another thing, that in between these cells left spaces, actually sometimes there are gaps between cells of capillary walls. Now remember one more thing, these capillaries, they are always present only near to the tissues. So let me draw these cells over here. Now in the beginning of this chapter, I gave you a little bit about idea about the tissues and organs. Now these are the same kind of cells. Whenever they join together, they make up the tissues. So suppose that this is a tissue Now, these are same kind of cells, they have joined together and they have made a tissue. Another thing, if you guys observe, that in between these tissue cells there are spaces will further increase. You see, we'll talk about the tissue fluid later on, but right now I'm just focusing on the capillaries as well. Now, if you guys can see that there are spaces between tissue cells. Now, these spaces, they are called as interstitial spaces. We will talk about them in detail in later when we'll talk about the tissue fluid and the lymphatic system, inshallah. Now, one very important thing which we are going to discuss right now, that you guys have learned before. In the next lecture, inshallah, we'll learn about the blood as well. The blood not only contains blood cells, it also contains blood plasma in which there is 90% water. I will explain that in detail in the next lecture. So, whenever, suppose if there is a pipe and that pipe has some holes in it, what happens from those holes? The things, they leak out. So same when there are gaps in between these cells of the capillary wall, so what will happen? The blood plasma seeps out. Now I am using the word seeps out, right? So what happens? That the blood plasma, it seeps out. And that blood plasma comes in between these spaces in between the tissue cells. I am representing it with the help of these black colored dots. So the blood plasma, it is seeping out and it is coming in between the spaces in between the tissue cells. Another interesting thing that you guys have learned in lower grades, which we'll learn in the next lecture in detail about the blood cells, you guys have learned that the white blood cells, they do not have a proper shape and their shape keeps on changing all the time. So what happens that through these spaces, even the white blood cells, what do? They squeeze out. Now again, I'm using the word, a specific word. Now what is this? This is a white blood cell which is squeezing out of gaps. When this white blood cell, it is squeezing out of the gap and it is going into the tissues and the spaces in between the tissues. So remember one thing, that the blood plasma and white blood cells, they are coming out of the blood capillaries. Now remember one thing, not all the blood plasma will come out and not all the white blood cells will come out. If all the blood plasma comes out, it simply means that the blood will stop flowing because it needs a liquid in which the blood will flow. So remember, if there is a pipe which is broken, which has holes, not all the liquid comes out, only the one which is high with higher pressure comes out. So simply that you see the blood plasma that will seep out and the cells, they will squeeze out of the gaps. Now, next thing which we are going to discuss about this function of these capillaries is that what happens here, exchange of materials happen. All of you guys have learned in detail that the red blood cells, they carry oxygen. I will explain that in detail in the next lecture as well, inshallah. Now, red blood cells, they carry oxygen because they have hemoglobin. I will explain that. Now, what happens that from the red blood cells, oxygen goes into the cells. Now, remember one thing, this oxygen moves by the process of osmosis from higher concentration towards the lower concentration. Now the up arrow simply means high concentration and low arrow simply means, down arrow simply means low concentration. Same thing that in this tissue, the process of respiration takes place. Now, you guys have learned respiration in detail in first term, and will learn it in detail inshallah at the end of this term as well, that respiration is breakdown of food to release energy. And whenever there is aerobic respiration, there is always production of carbon dioxide. So remember one thing which is very, very simple. Whenever carbon dioxide will be produced inside the tissue, so it means that inside the tissues the concentration of carbon dioxide will be higher, while in the blood plasma the concentration of carbon dioxide will be lower. So what will happen, that this carbon dioxide will move from the tissues into the blood plasma. So what has happened over here, the exchange of gases has taken place. Another very, very important job, what happens, that all the cells, they need nutrients, they need energy to survive. So just let me write nutrients. So here I'm writing nutrients, I'm circling it. So what happens, that from the blood, nutrients, they go into the tissues, and from the tissues the waste which is produced, that can be urea, that can be some other waste as well, that is transported back into the blood plasma. So not only the gases they are exchanged, the nutrients and waste is also exchanged in between the blood and the tissues because of the blood capillaries. So it means that the blood capillaries, they have very, very important function or very, very important job. The next thing which we are going to discuss is that at the end what happens, that these capillaries, when they join, they make venules. Now the next question comes in your mind, what are venules? So smaller veins, they are called as venules. And when these venules join together, they make larger veins. So this is all you need to know about the capillaries. Now next we are going to talk about is about the veins. Now according to your old concepts, you used to say that the veins carry deoxygenated blood. So remember one thing, that you stop saying that because you, in the last lecture, you guys observed that there are pulmonary veins which are bringing the blood back to the heart, which is oxygenated blood. So you never use the word that the veins carry deoxygenated blood, because there are veins which are carrying oxygenated blood. So what is the proper wording or definition we use? We say that veins carry blood back to heart, or you can also say towards heart. Next thing, if you guys remember, when we talked about the arteries, first of all we talked about the valves. Now remember one thing, the structure of the valves of both arteries and veins is similar, but there are differences. Again, I'm telling that we are only learning, we are only discussing of O levels. Now, again, this is the outer muscular layer, and this is the inner elastic layer. Now, if you guys see and you compare between the walls of the veins and the arteries, you can see that this is thin outer muscular layer and this one is thin inner elastic layer. So the arteries, they have thick outer muscular layer and thick inner, thick inner elastic layer, while the veins, they have thin outer muscular layer and thin inner elastic layer. Another difference which you will see, that if you guys remember, I told you about the lumen, that it is the empty space in which the blood flows. In the arteries, the lumen, it was narrow, but over here, veins have wider lumen. Next thing, that as veins, they have thin muscular and thin elastic layer, so they can't, you see, they can't contract and relax, they can't stretch and recoil with the same force as the arteries do. So it means that veins, they do not have pulse. So the veins, they do not have pulse. Next thing, that the veins, they are shallow. In our skin. Now the blood vessels which are easily visible in our body, they are actually veins because they are not deep into the tissues of the muscles, are shallow. They are not that much deep into our skin. Next, very, very important thing, that the veins, they have low blood pressure. Again, there are two reasons for the low blood pressure. One, that they have the wider lumen. And second, the blood is going back to the heart. It has lost its pressure. That is why the blood pressure is low in the veins. Now, because of the low blood pressure, there is a chance, suppose that when we are standing at that time, there is a chance that the blood can flow back in our legs. But the blood should not flow back, it should just move in.
Okay, boys, inshallah, in the next class, we'll solve the end of chapter questions of the respiratory system chapter and the circulatory system chapter, inshallah. All right, boys?
Okay, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir.
See you guys, inshallah, in next class. Take care and Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz, sir.
What about the
Allah Hafiz, sir.
Allah Hafiz.